On the evening of July 16th, 1999, at approximately 9:40 p.m., a single-engine Piper Saratoga is 7 miles from the shore of Martha's Vineyard, descending through haze over the Atlantic. There are 3 people on board. The pilot is on crutches. His wife and her sister are in the back seats. They are headed to a family wedding. The shoreline is ahead of them, but the pilot cannot see it. The haze as he raced the horizon, no line between water and sky, no visible edge of the earth. The airplane turns right. It climbs briefly. Then it begins to descend again, steeper now, accelerating. 1,000 feet per minute, 2,000, 3,000. The last radar return is recorded at 1,100 feet. 40 seconds later, the ocean. The pilot's name was John F. Kennedy Jr. His wife was Carolyn Bessette. Her sister was Lauren Bessette. And the story the country would tell about that night, the golden couple, the cursed family, the reckless flight, would be simpler and less true than what had actually been happening inside the marriage, inside the fame, and inside the particular kind of American life that made this ending not inevitable, but not to the people closest to them, entirely surprising. This is the story of 2 people who was sold to the public as a fairy tale and who discovered privately and painfully what it cost to live inside one. A man who had spent his entire life being watched, a woman who never wanted that life and found it unbearable. And the night the distance between those 2 experiences finally ran out of room. But to understand what was lost over that dark stretch of water, you have to go back further than the flight. You have to go back to the particular kind of life that made that flight feel necessary. The marriage that had turned a weekend social trip into something far heavier. And the 2 people at its center, one who had been raised inside the most watched family in America, and one who had never asked to be watched at all. This is the story of John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette. From the moment they found each other to the night the ocean swallowed them both. And it is not the story the public was sold. The public version is familiar enough. John F. Kennedy Jr. was described in the official language of networks and magazines and eventually of streaming platforms that would dramatize his life decades later as the closest thing America had to royalty. The phrase gets used so often it has lost its edges, but it meant something specific. It meant that from childhood onward, John existed inside a category the country had invented for him. Part grief object, part fantasy, part projection screen for whatever Americans wanted the Kennedy name to mean in a given decade. He was the son of a murdered president, the boy in the salute photograph, the handsome heir who rollerbladed through Manhattan and dated movie stars and somehow managed to seem approachable despite being the most recognizable young man in the country. That was the public John. The private one was more complicated and more human and more trapped. He was born on November 25th, 1960 in Washington, D.C., 17 days after his father won the presidency. The timing is worth pausing on. John did not enter the world and then become famous. He entered the world already inside the most photographed household in America. His nursery was the White House. His playground was the South Lawn. The images that survived from those years, the toddler crawling under the Resolute desk, the little boy peering out from behind the curtains of the Oval Office, the salute at his father's funeral on November 25th, 1963, which happened to be John's 3rd birthday, became fixed points in the national memory before John himself could form a memory of his own. He did not choose to become a symbol. He was made into one before he could speak. His mother understood, before anyone else in the family, what that kind of visibility would cost a child. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis had already lived through the worst thing a public life could deliver. She had been sitting next to her husband when his head was destroyed by a rifle round in Dallas, had crawled across the trunk of the car in footage that the country could not stop watching, and had then been expected to perform composure for the cameras at the funeral, while holding the hands of 2 children who could not yet understand what had happened to them. That experience taught Jackie something that would shape every decision she made for the rest of her life. The public would consume her family's pain if she let it, and the only defense was control. She spent the years after Dallas trying to construct an island of normalcy around John and his older sister Caroline. She moved them out of Washington and into a cooperative apartment at 1030 Fifth Avenue in New York. She enrolled them in schools where discretion was a condition of admission. During the White House years, she had set up a small kindergarten on the premises, brought in a pony named Macaroni, tried to build the illusion that her children could be children first and symbols second. After the assassination, after Bobby Kennedy's murder in Los Angeles in June of 1968, another killing, another public funeral, another round of grief performed for the cameras, Jackie made the decision that scandalized the nation. She married Aristotle Onassis on the island of Scorpios in October of that same year. The American public reacted with something close to betrayal. But Jackie was not making a romantic choice. She was making a strategic one. Onassis offered financial independence, geographic distance, and a private island where her children could exist without photographers behind every tree. What Jackie wanted for John and Caroline was deceptively simple, and in John's case, ultimately impossible. She wanted them to be known, but not consumed. The results of that upbringing were uneven. John grew up athletic, magnetic, and restless. He could walk into a room and make people feel recognized, a skill that came so naturally it was easy to mistake for superficiality. He kayaked, biked, and rollerbladed through the streets of Manhattan with a physicality that seemed to ground him when everything else felt weightless. He went to Brown University, where he studied history and was remembered less for academic rigor than for an ease that drew people in. Classmates recalled a man who seemed genuinely uninterested in leveraging his name, who wore it lightly, who seemed to want, more than anything, to be liked for who he was rather than for who his father had been. After Brown, Jackie steered him toward New York University School of Law. John did not burn to become a lawyer, but Jackie believed that a professional credential would give him something solid beneath the celebrity, something the name alone could not provide. He took the bar exam and failed. He took it again and failed again. The New York tabloids turned those failures into a recurring national joke. The New York Post ran the headline, "The Hunk Flunks." And John absorbed the humiliation with the practiced calm his mother had spent years teaching him. He passed on his third attempt, took a job as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan, prosecuted cases in a courtroom where jurors sometimes struggled to look at the defendant because they were staring at the prosecutor, and discovered that the structure of the law gave him a steadiness that the rest of his life often lacked. But the law was Jackie's vision, not his. What John actually wanted was harder to name, and in the end, harder to sustain. He wanted to build something that belonged to him, not to the dynasty, not to the myth, not to the endless public appetite for another Kennedy entering politics. That impulse led him, in 1995, to launch George, a glossy magazine that attempted something genuinely unusual, treating politics as a culture, making it visual, accessible, and unapologetically pop. The debut issue featured Cindy Crawford dressed as George Washington on the cover, and the media attention was enormous. John stood at the podium at the launch event and introduced the magazine with a confidence that seemed, for once, fully earned. For a brief and genuinely hopeful window, George looked like the answer to the question that had followed John his entire adult life. What would the son of John F. Kennedy become? Not a senator, not a president, a magazine founder, something self-made, or as close to self-made as a Kennedy could get. There is another principal figure in this story who must be understood before the narrative can continue, and her name is one the public would eventually flatten into a footnote, or worse, a fashion comparison. Carolyn Bessette came from a different America. She was born on January 7th, 1966, in White Plains, New York, and raised primarily in Greenwich, Connecticut, after her parents divorced when she was young. Her mother, Anne, remarried an orthopedic surgeon named Richard Freeman, and the household Carolyn grew up in was comfortable, stable, and thoroughly middle class by the particular standards of Greenwich. She attended St. Mary's, a Catholic school, and then Boston University, where she studied elementary education. Nothing about Carolyn's childhood was dynastic. Nothing about it predicted what was coming. She was not born into expectation. She was not groomed for spectacle. She built herself. What Carolyn had from early on was a quality that the people who knew her best struggled to reduce to a single word. She was beautiful. That much was obvious and widely noted and eventually suffocating. But beauty alone does not explain the effect she had on the people around her. Friends and colleagues from her years in fashion described something closer to a social intelligence so precise it felt almost physical. A way of reading a room, of making the person she was speaking to feel like the only one in it, of combining genuine warmth with an aesthetic control that made everything around her seem slightly more intentional. She moved from Boston University into the fashion world, starting at a Calvin Klein boutique in the Chestnut Hill Mall outside Boston, then relocating to New York, where she rose through the Calvin Klein organization from retail sales into the public relations and celebrity dressing side of the business. By her late 20s, she was working alongside editors, photographers, stylists in the inner machinery of the New York fashion establishment. She understood how image worked. She understood how to construct one. And she carried herself with a composure that people in her orbit recognize as genuine sophistication, not performance. That skill, the ability to manage surface and substance at the same time, is what made her magnetic to John and is exactly what would fail to protect her. Because managing image in a controlled professional environment is a fundamentally different discipline from managing it under permanent, unrelenting, and frequently hostile public surveillance. Carolyn had built her life through taste, effort, and social precision. None of that prepared her for a world in which photographers would follow her to the grocery store, shout questions about her marriage from across the street, and sell the worst frame to the highest bidder. The two of them met in the early 1990s, and even their beginning belongs partly to myth rather than confirmed record. Some accounts place the first encounter at the Calvin Klein showroom in 1992. Others describe an early meeting in Central Park, casual and unremarkable at the time. What is not in dispute is that by 1994, the relationship had become serious, that by 1995, they were engaged, and that Carolyn had stepped, willingly but without full understanding of the cost, into the most surveilled romantic life in America. There is something worth sitting with about the way they complemented each other in those early years. John had spent his entire life learning to perform ease under scrutiny. Carolyn had spent hers learning to command a room without needing to be the loudest person in it. It was the man the country watched. She was the woman who made him look for the first time, like he had found someone who was not awed by the machinery around him. One account from a friend close to both of them would later note that John liked it when Carolyn got all the attention, that he was secure enough, or perhaps relieved enough, to enjoy the moments when the cameras pointed somewhere other than at him. That detail matters because it reveals the balance the relationship had at its best. Two people who each carried a kind of magnetism and who, for a time, let those forces work together rather than against each other. The wedding happened on September 21st, 1996, on Cumberland Island, Georgia, a remote barrier island off the coast, accessible only by ferry, covered in live oaks, draped with Spanish moss. The location was chosen with surgical deliberation, no paparazzi, no helicopters overhead, no society reporters with early invitations, just a small wooden chapel, the First African Baptist Church, a one-room clapboard building with no electricity, lit by candles and kerosene lamps, holding fewer than 40 guests. Caroline Kennedy served as matron of honor. Lauren Bessette, Carolyn's older sister, was maid of honor. Anthony Radziwill, John's cousin and the closest thing he had to a brother, stood as best man. Caroline's 3 children were part of the ceremony. The officiant was a local minister, not a Kennedy family priest. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There is so much more to this family that the public never saw, and we're just getting started. The details of that evening deserve to be constructed carefully, because they reveal what John and Carolyn were trying to build and what they believed in that moment was still possible. Carolyn wore a pearl-colored silk crepe slip dress, bias cut, designed by Narciso Rodriguez, with a veil of silk tulle held by a crystal-beaded comb that had belonged to John's mother. The dress was not couture spectacle. It was spare, clean, almost austere, a garment designed to exist inside candlelight in a small room, not on a stage. John wore a dark blue wool suit and a white piqué vest. When a photographer named Dennis Reggie captured the only authorized image, the couple walking from the church, their hands intertwined, Carolyn's veil catching the evening air, the photograph became one of the most iconic wedding images of the century, but its power came precisely from its suggestion of privacy. The world saw one frame. The rest of the evening belonged to them. That night on Cumberland Island was the last successful act of privacy in this story. It was the last time the balance held. But before the fracture, a few other figures need to be understood, because this is not a two-person story. It is a story that runs through a family constellation, and by 1996, the people closest to John and Carolyn were carrying their own weight. Lauren Bessette, Carolyn's twin in closeness, if not in birth, was 30 years old at the wedding. She had taken a different path than her sister, not fashion but finance, grinding through the institutional pipeline from analyst to Wharton MBA to a career at Morgan Stanley that included a posting in Hong Kong. Lauren was disciplined, competent, and fiercely loyal to Carolyn. As the marriage came under increasing pressure, Lauren would become one of the few people Carolyn trusted completely. A sibling anchor in a world where most of the people around her were connected, in some way, to the Kennedy machinery. Anthony Radziwill, John's best man, was the son of Lee Radziwill, Jackie's sister, which made him John's first cousin. But the relationship went deeper than bloodline. Anthony functioned as the brother John did not otherwise have, a confidant, a counterweight, a person who understood the particular absurdity and burden of the Kennedy orbit from the inside. By the mid-90s, Anthony had been diagnosed with cancer, and though the full weight of that diagnosis hadn't yet reached its final stage, the knowledge that his closest male companion was fighting a terminal illness already shadowed John's emotional landscape. These figures, Lauren, Anthony, and the ever-present but increasingly distant Caroline Kennedy, who by then was married with 3 children and trying to build a quieter life, formed the private architecture around John and Carolyn's marriage. Each of them would be drawn into the ending. When the couple returned from Cumberland Island to their loft on North Moore Street in Tribeca, the machinery they had escaped for one evening was waiting at the door. The honeymoon period ended quickly, though there were real months of happiness in between that the documentary must honor, because without them, the loss means nothing. In those first months of marriage, the Tribeca loft became the center of a life that from the inside probably felt closer to ordinary than anything either of them had experienced. They had a dog, a Friday, a canary. They had the gallery openings and the benefit dinners and the downtown restaurant circuit that constituted the social life of a certain kind of 90s New York couple. John still rode his bike to the George offices. Carolyn still dressed with the severe, minimalist elegance that made fashion editors study every photograph. Friends from that period describe evenings that were warm, funny, and surprisingly low-key. John cooking pasta in the kitchen, Carolyn holding court on the sofa, the kind of intimate domesticity that was genuinely difficult to reconcile with the spectacle waiting outside. For a time, the marriage worked the way they had hoped the Cumberland Island wedding promised it could. Private, real, theirs. But the difference between John's experience of what came next and Carolyn's is where the real fracture starts. John had been photographed since infancy. He understood the rhythms of public attention, when to smile, when to wave, when to keep walking, when to give the camera just enough to make it leave. It was not that the scrutiny did not bother him. It was that he had been raised from the age of 3 in the Jackie method. Composure as defense, poise as strategy, the understanding that the public's appetite could be managed if you fed it carefully and never let it see you bleed. He had internalized that discipline so deeply it had become indistinguishable from his personality. John could walk through a gauntlet of photographers and emerge looking unbothered because, in a sense, he had been doing it since before he could read. Carolyn had no such training, and what she encountered after the wedding was not the same attention John encountered. Later accounts from friends and from people close to the couple describe a pattern that is difficult to hear. When John and Carolyn were together, the photographers kept a workable distance. They got their shots and moved on. But when Carolyn was alone, walking to get coffee, leaving the apartment for an errand, stepping outside without John beside her, the dynamic changed. Photographers closed in. They shouted at her. They called her name, and when she did not respond, called her worse things. They taunted her with questions designed to provoke a visible reaction. Was the marriage falling apart? Was she pregnant? Was she having an affair? Was she good enough? The goal was never information. The goal was an image, a single frame of Carolyn looking distressed, angry, tearful, or out of control because that frame was worth money. A composed Carolyn sold nothing. A shattered Carolyn sold magazines. That asymmetry is essential to understanding what happened to this marriage. John could not fully see the severity of what Carolyn was describing because it did not happen when he was there. He experienced the press as an annoyance he had managed his whole life. She experienced it as something closer to predation, gendered, personal, and escalating. And the gap between those two experiences began to erode the foundation on which the relationship had been built. Carolyn was not being dramatic. She was not being fragile. She was being hunted on a different schedule than her husband by people who behaved differently when the Kennedy name was not physically standing beside her. Then, in August of 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed in a car crash in a Paris tunnel, pursued by paparazzi. The world reacted with public grief. Carolyn reacted with something more precise. Friends would later say she was rattled, not in the diffuse way a person is rattled by a distant celebrity death, but in the way a person is rattled when they see their own fear, made suddenly, violently real. Diana had been the most photographed woman in the world. Carolyn was becoming one of the most photographed women in New York. The machinery around Diana and the machinery around Carolyn operated on the same principles, used the same tools, and pursued the same product. An image taken without consent, sold for profit. That machinery, Carolyn now understood, did not merely intrude. It could chase you into a tunnel at speed and not stop when you stopped. That understanding changed something inside the marriage that did not change back. It did not end the relationship, but it introduced a fear that settled in permanently, a vigilance that turned the ordinary rhythms of New York life, the things that used to come easily, into calculations. Walking outside required thought. Meeting a friend for dinner meant planning an exit. Leaving the building on North Moore Street in the morning meant deciding whether the cost of being photographed was worth whatever waited on the other side. Carolyn began staying in more. She saw fewer people. She relied more on the people she already trusted, her sister Lauren most of all, and retreated from the wider social life that had once been one of her great strengths. And John, watching this happen, found himself caught between two impulses he could not reconcile. He loved Carolyn. He understood, on some level, that the life attached to his name was compressing her. But he had been raised to believe that the correct response to external pressure was composure. That you held your posture, you managed the situation, you endured, and you did not let the outside world dictate the terms of your private life. Jackie had taught him that. Jackie had lived it, from Dallas to Scorpius to Fifth Avenue, with a discipline that became one of the most admired performances in American public life. John had watched his mother handle grief, handle scrutiny, handle the worst kind of loss with a stillness that the world mistook for strength, and that was, in reality, closer to armor. And what John could not fully absorb was that Carolyn was not Jackie. Carolyn had not been raised inside the fortress. She had walked into it as an adult, in love, and discovered that the walls were not keeping the world out. They were keeping her in. Publicly, by the end of 1997, they still looked perfect. The photographs from that period show the couple the public wanted to see. Impeccably dressed, photogenic, moving through the streets of Tribeca with a dog, and a kind of New York elegance that made magazine editors reach for the word iconic. They looked in those images like the life everyone wanted and no one actually had. But behind the photographs, the marriage had already become a survival test. The thing threatening it was the one thing neither of them could switch off: his name, her visibility, and the relentless gendered machinery of a culture that wanted the fairy tale far more than it wanted the truth. What came next would be worse. By 1998, the pressures on John were no longer arriving one at a time. They were layering, them professional, personal, physical, emotional, each one compounding the others in a way that left less and less room for the person underneath. George, the magazine that was supposed to be John's declaration of independence from the Kennedy myth, was losing altitude. The early excitement of the launch had given way to the harder reality of sustaining a publication in a market that was already shifting beneath everyone's feet. Advertising revenue softened. The editorial identity, which had always oscillated between serious political commentary and celebrity gloss, never fully resolved into something readers could depend on from issue to issue. One month, George ran a thoughtful profile of a rising senator. The next month, the cover featured a model in a provocative pose alongside a political headline that read like satire. Advertisers want consistency, readers want a reason to return. George offered Dazzle instead, and Dazzle has a shelf life. Michael Berman, the co founder and business partner, who had handled much of the operational machinery, had departed after a power struggle that left John more exposed than he had ever been professionally. Without Berman, John was not just the editorial voice and the public face of the magazine. He was the person fielding the business problems, managing the internal staff tensions, and absorbing the increasingly pointed skepticism of the Hachette Philly-Patchy executives who owned the publishing infrastructure and were beginning to ask, in the language of corporate parents everywhere, whether George could justify its continued existence. The magazine that was supposed to prove John was more than a famous name, was instead becoming a daily reminder that a famous name could open every door in the building and still not guarantee the building would stand. That professional erosion mattered because it removed one of John's key sources of identity at precisely the moment his marriage needed him to be emotionally available, a man who is losing confidence in his own creation, who is spending more of his energy defending a project that once felt effortless, has less of himself to bring home. And what was waiting at home by late 1998 was a wife whose world had contracted to the dimensions of an apartment. Carolyn's withdrawal deepened in the ways that the people closest to her found increasingly difficult to watch. She went out less, saw fewer people, and relied more heavily on the small circle she still trusted. Lauren above all, a few close friends from the Calvin Klein years, the people who had known her before the name changed and who could still see her as Carolyn rather than as Mrs. Kennedy. The spontaneity that had once defined her social life had been replaced by a kind of siege calculation. Going outside meant weighing whether the errand was worth the cost of being photographed. Attending a dinner meant calculating the route in and the route out and whether anyone at the table would later talk to a reporter. The woman who had once moved through New York with the fluid confidence of someone who understood exactly how to inhabit a room was now, by several accounts, spending long stretches of the day inside the Tribeca loft, curtains closed against the street below, choosing isolation over a city that had become, for her, a surveillance grid with no off switch. Friends noticed. Lauren noticed. The question was whether anyone could do anything about it when the source of the problem was not a situation, but an identity. The permanent, unalterable fact of being married to the most famous young man in America. John's response was complicated, and it is worth being honest about the tension, rather than flattening it into a simple narrative of neglect or misunderstanding. He was not indifferent to what was happening to Carolyn. Later reporting describes him quietly reaching out to security professionals, including executives at a private security firm, to discuss what real protection might look like for the couple going forward. One conversation, recalled afterward by a security executive, is especially revealing and especially painful. John told a man that he and Carolyn were thinking about starting a family and that he wanted to understand how they would protect their children from the kind of attention that was already damaging their marriage. He asked practical questions. He wanted to know about logistics, about routines, about how other public families had managed the problem. That single reported conversation does several things at once. It tells you that John's vision of the future still included the Carolyn and still included children. It tells you he understood the threat clearly enough to seek professional help. And it sharpens the tragedy to something nearly unbearable because the life he was trying to plan, the protected family, the children growing up shielded from the worst of the attention, was a version of exactly what Jackie had tried to build for him and Caroline 40 years earlier. He was trying to reproduce his mother's fortress for a new generation. He did not live long enough to discover whether it would have worked. But understanding the threat and knowing how to respond to it inside a marriage are not the same skill. John had been raised in the Jackie model. Composure, endurance, the long game. That model assumed the external pressure was something you outlasted, not something that required you to change the terms of your own life. Carolyn needed something different. She needed John to acknowledge, not just privately but structurally, that the life they were living was unsustainable in its current form, whether that meant moving, stepping back from public life, fundamentally altering the daily calculus of how they existed in the world. Those were the conversations the marriage needed, and by most accounts, those conversations were happening, but they were happening inside a framework of increasing frustration on both sides. There is an earlier incident that belongs in this part of the story, not because it is the most important moment, but because of what it revealed about the machinery waiting to consume them. In February of 1996, before the wedding, John and Carolyn had a fight in Washington Square Park. The details, reconstructed from later reporting and eyewitness accounts, describe a volatile argument. Shouting, physical pushing, the reported removal of an engagement ring played out on a public sidewalk while a photographer captured the entire sequence. The images were sold, they were published everywhere, and they became the first major data point in the tabloid narrative that would follow the couple for the rest of their lives. The beautiful pair who fought, who were not as perfect as they looked, whose private pain could be captured and commodified in real time. What matters about the Washington Square Park fight is not the argument itself. Couples argue. The heat of a relationship between two intense, strong-willed people is not by itself a scandal. What matters is what the images did. They turned a private conflict into a national consumable. They established a template. John and Carolyn as a troubled couple, Carolyn as volatile, the marriage as performatively glamorous but privately unstable. That would be recycled and reinforced by every subsequent photograph, every subsequent rumor, every subsequent tabloid cover for the next 3 years. The fight happened once. The images circulated forever. And Carolyn, who was already struggling with the asymmetry of how she was treated by the press, now had to live inside a public narrative that had been constructed from her worst private moment. The final year tightened the vise from multiple directions at once. Anthony Radziwill, John's cousin, and the closest thing he had to a brother, was dying. The cancer that had been diagnosed years earlier had progressed, and by the spring and summer of 1999, Anthony's condition was terminal. The weight of that impending loss is difficult to overstate. Anthony was not a peripheral figure in John's life. He was one of the very few people who understood the Kennedy world from the inside. The absurdity of it, the loneliness of it, the way the name distorted every relationship. And who could talk to John without the filter of deference or fascination that most people brought? Losing Anthony meant losing one of the last people who saw John clearly. And it was happening at the exact moment when John needed that kind of clarity most. Then came the injury. On June 1st, 1999, John was involved in a hang gliding accident and fractured his left ankle. He had surgery the following day. He came out of the cast and into a walking boot, then progressed to a straight cane. The recovery was slow enough that on July 16th, the last day of his life, he was still walking with a mild but documented limp. The ankle injury matters on 2 levels. Practically, it affected his mobility in the cockpit. Symbolically, it took away one of the primary ways John had always regulated his emotional life. He was a man of motion, kayaking, biking, rollerblading, paragliding, flying. Physical competence was central to how he understood himself, and suddenly he was hobbled, dependent on a cane, physically diminished at the exact moment he was emotionally and professionally under more strain than he had ever faced. The marriage, by that final summer, was at a point that resists the clean narratives both sides of the tabloid debate would later impose. Multiple later accounts and recent reporting described the couple as being at a critical juncture, attending counseling, arguing about the fundamental terms of their life together, struggling over questions of intimacy, privacy, children, and whether a future family could exist under the kind of scrutiny they were already failing to survive. At the same time, friends who resisted the more lurid breakup narratives insisted the couple were still trying to repair things, still capable of tenderness, still connected by something real, even as the structure around them deteriorated. That ambiguity is not a weakness in the story, it is the story. John and Carolyn were not a couple who had given up. They were a couple still in the middle of deciding whether the thing they had built could be saved. One particularly revealing thread from that final period, the trip to Rory Kennedy's wedding. Rory, the youngest of Robert and Ethel Kennedy's 11 children, was getting married in Hyannisport on July 17th. Attending was expected. It was a family event, the kind of weekend obligation that came with the name. But later accounts suggest that Carolyn's willingness to go was itself meaningful. She had been withdrawing from Kennedy family events. She had been pulling back from the public engagements that came with being John's wife. The fact that she agreed to make this trip was read by some people close to the couple as a sign that the marriage was still being worked on, that Carolyn was still investing in the relationship even as the relationship was costing her more than she had ever imagined it would. They were not boarding the plane because the relationship was over. They were boarding it while still in the middle of trying to decide what the relationship could survive. On Friday, July 16th, 1999, the plan was straightforward in the way that plans always are before they become the last thing someone ever did. John would fly from Essex County Airport in Caldwell, New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard, drop off Lauren Bessette, then continue with Carolyn to Hyannisport on the Cape for Rory Kennedy's wedding the following day. It was a family weekend, a social obligation, a flight John had made variations of before. The airplane was a Piper Saratoga 2HP, a single-engine, high-performance aircraft that John had owned for about 2 months. He had logged approximately 36 total hours in the airplane, 9.4 of those at night. He liked it. He was comfortable in it. He had not yet had enough time in it to know its personality in every condition. The day unfolded with the ordinary frictions of a Friday departure in the middle of a New York summer. Traffic was bad. Schedules slipped. John drove Lauren to the airport from the city, navigating the kind of congested bridge and highway crawl that turns a 40-minute drive into an hour and a half. Carolyn arrived at the airfield separately. Later reporting, drawn from biographical work and interviews with people close to the family rather than from official aviation records, describes the kind of logistical scramble that precedes any group trip. Luggage being loaded, timing being negotiated, the small compromises of getting 3 adults to the same departure point on the same evening when everyone's day had already run long. None of it was dramatic, all of it was ordinary. A woman's weekend bag, a man on crutches, a sister riding along. That ordinariness is what makes the contrast later nearly impossible to bear. Witnesses at Essex County Airport saw John arrive using crutches. His left ankle, fractured 6 weeks earlier in the hang gliding accident, was still healing. He had been cleared from the walking boot to a straight cane just that day, but he was still moving with the careful, slightly off-balance gait of a man who did not fully trust his own footing. He loaded luggage into the Saratoga. He spoke briefly with other people on the field. Nothing about his behavior suggested urgency or distress. The departure, to anyone watching, looked routine. Air traffic records show the Piper Saratoga taxiing at approximately 8:34 in the evening and lifting off just after 8:38. The sun had set at 8:14. Civil twilight, the period in which there is still enough ambient light to see the horizon clearly, ended at 8:47, 9 minutes after takeoff. Nautical twilight, the deeper dimming after which the horizon becomes unreliable without instruments, ended at 9:28. By then, John was over the water. By 9:40, the moon hung just 11.5 degrees above the horizon, providing roughly 19% illumination. It was not dark the way a closet is dark. It was dark the way the open ocean is dark when there is nothing to see. John had approximately 310 total flight hours. About 55 of those were at night. He was not instrument rated, meaning he was certified to fly by visual reference to the ground and the horizon, but not certified to fly solely by reference to his instruments in conditions where the outside world disappeared. On a clear night, with a visible horizon and a lit shoreline ahead, the distinction would not have mattered. On this night, it mattered absolutely. Other pilots flying similar routes that evening later reported that a thick haze had settled over the water between the mainland and the islands. The haze did not eliminate visibility in a strict meteorological sense. The official weather observations did not describe conditions that would have grounded a visual flight rules pilot on paper. But the haze did something more insidious than creating fog or producing a wall of white. It erased gradients. It removed the boundary between water and sky. A pilot looking out the windshield over the open Atlantic on a hazy, barely moonlit night would not see darkness and would not see cloud. He would see a featureless gray-black continuum in which up and down, sky and ocean, climbing and descending, became indistinguishable from each other. The technical term is spatial disorientation, and it is one of the most common killers of private pilots, particularly those without instrument ratings. It works by exploiting the design of the human body itself. The inner ear, which provides the brain's primary sense of balance and motion, functions reliably when it has visual confirmation. When you can see the ground, the horizon, a reference point that tells your brain which way is down. Remove that visual reference, and the inner ear begins to lie. It will tell you that you are climbing when you are descending. It will tell you that you are flying wings level when you are banking into a tightening spiral. And the lies do not feel like lies. They feel like the most certain thing in the world. Fighting them requires trusting your instruments over your own body, a skill that instrument-rated pilots train for extensively, and that visual-only pilots, by definition, have not been taught to do. The Piper Saratoga climbed out of Coldwell normally and headed northeast toward the coast. For the first portion of the flight, John had the lights of the Connecticut and Long Island shorelines to his left and right. He had visual reference. The airplane tracked steadily. Then over the water, the references disappeared. About 34 miles west of Martha's Vineyard, the airplane began to descend from 5,500 feet. The descent was not alarming at first. It could have been the beginning of a normal approach. But about 7 miles from the island's shore, the airplane began to behave in a way that told a different story. It turned right, it stopped descending, it climbed briefly, it turned again. Then it entered another descent, this one steeper, faster, and accelerating. The radar data, stripped of all speculation and reduced to numbers, shows an airplane that is no longer being flown toward a destination. It is being flown by a pilot who has lost his reference to the Earth. The descent rate increased. It passed 1,000 feet per minute. It passed 2,000. It passed 3,000. In the final moments, the airplane was descending at more than 4,700 feet per minute, nearly straight down. The last radar return was recorded at 9:40 and 34 seconds in the evening at an altitude of 1,100 feet. The estimated time of impact was approximately 9:41. The airplane struck the water about 7.5 miles southwest of Gay Head, Martha's Vineyard, in roughly 116 feet of ocean. The impact was not survivable. All three people on board, John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr., 38 years old, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, 33 years old, and Lauren Gale Bessette, 34 years old, died instantly. The National Transportation Safety Board's probable cause finding, issued after months of investigation, was direct. The pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane during a descent over water at night, which was a result of spatial disorientation. Contributing factors were the haze and the dark night conditions. There was no evidence of a pre-impact mechanical malfunction. The engine was running. The instruments were functioning. The airplane did what it was told. It was told by a pilot whose senses had betrayed him to fly into the ocean. There is one correction that the record demands, and it belongs here because the outline's authority depends on refusing to let mythology replace fact. Later, dramatizations and tabloid reconstructions sometimes depicted Carolyn moving forward into the cockpit in the final moments, reaching for John, the couple's last contact framed as a cinematic gesture. The evidence does not support that image. When the wreckage was located on July 20th and the bodies recovered the following day, all three passengers were found in their seats, still strapped in. Carolyn and Lauren were in the back. John was in the front left. The ending was not a dramatic scene. It was the silent physics of an airplane descending into water faster than anyone inside it could understand what was happening. The wreckage sat on the ocean floor for 4 days before it was found. The search, involving the Coast Guard, the Navy, no AA assets, and a level of federal resource deployment that reflected the weight of the Kennedy name as much as standard missing aircraft protocol, dominated the American news cycle from Saturday morning onward. Every network led with it. Every cable channel ran continuous coverage. The country watched the way it had watched other Kennedy emergencies, with a mixture of grief, fascination, and the uneasy recognition that this family's tragedies had become a kind of national ritual. The Kennedy compound in Hyannisport became, once again, a site of public vigil and private devastation. The same lawns, the same hedges, the same sense of a family, absorbing a blow that the cameras would record and the country would consume. Rory Kennedy's wedding, the event that had been the reason for the flight, was canceled. The guests who had been arriving for a celebration found themselves arriving instead for a vigil, with no body to mourn and no certainty about what had happened beneath the water. And then on July 21st, the bodies were brought up from the water. The confirmation came. The public grief machine activated with the speed and scale that the Kennedy name had always commanded. Vigils formed, magazines cleared their covers. Television anchors used the word tragedy in the same cadence they had used it in 1963, because the country had not yet found a new vocabulary for losing a Kennedy. But inside that public machinery, there were people whose grief was not symbolic and whose loss could not be narrated by a television anchor in a sober tone. Caroline Kennedy, 41 years old, had just become the sole surviving member of her immediate family. Her father had been shot in Dallas when she was 5. Her uncle Bobby had been killed in Los Angeles when she was 10. Her mother had died of lymphoma in May of 1994 at 64, and Carolyn had been at her bedside. And now her brother, the boy who had saluted beside her at the funeral, the man who had stood with her at their mother's hospital bed, the last living person who shared her exact, unreplicable experience of what it meant to grow up as a Kennedy child, and was gone. She had no parents. She had no siblings. She had the name, the foundation, and the memory. That was what was left. On the Bessette side, the devastation was different in kind, but not in depth. Anne Freeman, Carolyn and Lauren's mother, had lost 2 daughters in a single night, not to illness, not to age, not to anything she could have anticipated or prevented, but to a plane crash connected to a world she had never sought, and a family her daughters had married and accompanied into. Lauren was not a Kennedy. Lauren was a Morgan Stanley executive who had agreed to ride along for the weekend. The randomness of her death and the sheer contingency of being the sister who said yes to the trip made the loss harder to metabolize, not easier. The aftermath had not yet begun. The burial had not happened. The investigation was still open. The magazine John had built was still publishing. The question about what had gone wrong in the cockpit, what had gone wrong in the marriage, what had gone wrong in the equation that put a non-instrument rated pilot over dark water on a hazy night had not yet been answered, and some of them never would be. The ocean had taken them. What it left behind was still unfolding. The grief arrived in layers, and not all of them were equal. The public layer came first, and it came with the velocity and scale that the Kennedy name had always commanded in moments of loss. Within hours of the confirmation that the plane was missing, before the wreckage had been located, before any cause had been established, the American media apparatus had shifted into the mode it reserved for Kennedy tragedies. Continuous coverage, historical montages, anchors speaking in the measured, reverent cadence that network television uses when it knows the audience is already mourning. The coverage was not inaccurate, but it was already shaping the story into a form the public could consume. John was framed as the last prince of Camelot, the boy in the salute photograph finally claimed by the same curse that had haunted his family across 4 decades. Flowers appeared outside the Tribeca loft on Northmore Street. Vigils materialized in front of the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, at the JFK Library in Boston, at locations connected to the name in ways that had more to do with national mythology than with the 3 specific human beings who had actually died. The mourning was real, but it was also in a way that the people inside it could feel, even through their own devastation. A performance, the country processing its own relationship with the Kennedy name through the bodies of 3 people it had never known. Because inside that public mourning, the hierarchy of attention that had defined the story while John and Carolyn were alive reasserted itself immediately. John was the center. He was mourned as the son, the heir, the symbol. Carolyn was mourned as an attachment. John's wife, the woman beside the prince, the beautiful complement to a Kennedy narrative. Lauren Bessette, the 3rd person on the airplane, was mentioned and then passed over. Her name appearing in the lower paragraphs of newspaper accounts and fading from television coverage within days. The same machinery that had consumed Carolyn while she was alive, reducing her from a complex, intelligent, fully realized person to an image, a surface, an accessory to a more famous name, continued to operate after her death, sorting the 3 victims into a hierarchy of significance based not on the lives they had lived, but on the names they carried. And almost immediately, something worse than erasure began. Rumors circulated, at first in tabloid whispers, then in more confident media assertions, that Carolyn had delayed the flight. The versions varied in their specifics but shared a common shape. She had been at a salon, she had been getting her nails done, she had been late because she could not decide what to wear or what to pack. The variations did not matter. The architecture of the accusation was always the same. Blame the woman. The implication, sometimes stated outright and sometimes left to the reader's inference, was that if Carolyn had not been late, the flight would have departed earlier, the light would have been better, the haze would not have been as thick, and the crash might not have happened. It was a narrative built on speculation and sustained by the same gendered machinery that had tormented Carolyn while she was alive. The assumption that a woman's vanity was the real danger, that her inability to manage herself had endangered the man beside her. Even in death, the public found a way to make Carolyn the problem. The harder fact, established by later reporting and biographical work that drew on people who were actually present that day, is simpler and less satisfying to the blame seekers. All three of them were late. Traffic delayed the drive from the city. The logistics of getting three people to a New Jersey airfield on a Friday evening in July, through the Holland Tunnel, through the suburban sprawl, consumed more time than anyone had planned. The departure was later than intended for reasons that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with the ordinary, unremarkable friction of summer travel. But the salon rumor persisted for years, recycled in magazine retrospectives and whispered in conversations about the crash, because it served a narrative purpose that the actual cause could not. Blaming Carolyn was easier and more emotionally satisfying than accepting that the crash was the result of atmospheric conditions and a pilot certification gap. Causes too impersonal, too mechanical, too devoid of human drama to feed the public's appetite for a story with a villain. The NTSB report named Hayes in spatial disorientation. The tabloids named Carolyn. The tabloids' version lasted longer. Lauren Bessette's death occupied an even smaller space in the public conversation. And that absence is itself a kind of injustice the script must name rather than replicate. Lauren was not a footnote. She was not a supporting character in someone else's tragedy. She was 34 years old. She had built a career in investment banking that reflected genuine ambition and genuine ability, from analyst work to a Wharton MBA to senior positions at Morgan Stanley, that included a posting in Hong Kong where she lived and worked in an environment that had nothing to do with the Kennedy orbit and everything to do with her own competence. She spoke Cantonese. She moved between continents. She had the kind of career that, in any other context, would have been the center of its own story. And in the final years of the marriage, as Carolyn's world contracted under the pressure of surveillance, Lauren had become one of the few people who could reach her sister without having to navigate the Kennedy machinery first. Their bond was not incidental, it was structural. Lauren understood Carolyn not as Mrs. Kennedy, but as the woman she had grown up with, and that understanding made Lauren irreplaceable at exactly the moment Carolyn needed her most. Lauren was on that airplane because she was a good sister who was going to Martha's Vineyard for the weekend, and the stop to drop her off was the reason the flight went to the vineyard at all before continuing to Hyannisport. Her death was not a subplot. It was a full, achieved, still unfolding life ended by the same set of circumstances that ended the other two. And the fact that the public remembers her least is the final proof of the hierarchy this story has been tracking from the beginning. The famous name absorbs the light. Everyone standing near it disappears into the shadow. The burial arrangements became, like everything else connected to the Kennedy name, a site of intense public interest and careful private negotiation. The bodies were cremated. On July 22nd, 6 days after the crash, the ashes of John, Carolyn, and Lauren were scattered at sea from the deck of the USS Briscoe, a Navy destroyer, in a ceremony conducted off the coast of Martha's Vineyard near the site of the crash. The Briscoe sailed out in the early morning. Family members from both the Kennedy and Bessette sides stood on the deck. A priest conducted a Catholic ceremony. The ashes went into the water that had taken them. President Clinton ordered the military aircraft that transported the families. The Navy provided the ship. The ritual was conducted with the kind of institutional gravity that the Kennedys had always commanded in death, a gravity disproportionate to the facts of who John actually was. He was not a senator or a president or a military officer. He was a magazine editor and a private pilot. But he was buried with the resources of the state because the name carried that weight whether the person inside it had asked for it or not. Even in death, the machinery operated on its own logic. And then, just 25 days after John's plane hit the water, the overlapping architecture of that summer's devastation completed itself. On August 10th, 1999, Anthony Radziwill died of cancer at the age of 40. He had been fighting the disease for years, had endured treatments and remissions and returns, and by the time of John's death, he was already in the terminal phase of his decline. The closeness of the two losses is almost impossible to process as separate events. John and Anthony had grown up together, had functioned as brothers inside a family structure that did not otherwise provide John with one, had shared the particular understanding that comes from inhabiting the Kennedy world from the inside, the absurdity and the weight and the loneliness of being watched all the time. Anthony had been John's best man. John had been one of the people Anthony relied on as the cancer progressed. And now both of them were gone within a single month, and the people caught between those two deaths, Carolyn Kennedy, who had known Anthony her entire life, Carol Radziwill, Anthony's wife, who had been close to both John and Carolyn, were left to grieve in an overlapping field of loss so dense that one tragedy could not be separated from the other. The summer of 1999 did not deliver one blow to the people inside this story. It delivered a sequence of blows so compressed that recovery from the first had not even begun before the second landed. The institutional aftermath moved on its own timeline, indifferent to grief. The NTSB investigation proceeded methodically through the rest of 1999 and into 2000, as investigators examined the recovered wreckage, reviewed the radar data, interviewed witnesses and other pilots who had flown similar routes that night, and assembled a factual and analytical record that would become the final report. When that report was issued, it confirmed what the radar data had already suggested and what experienced pilots had suspected from the beginning. The probable cause was the pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane during a descent over water at night, which resulted from spatial disorientation. The contributing factors were environmental, the haze conditions, and the dark night. Not mechanical. John's pipe at Saratoga had been functioning properly. The instruments had been working. The engine had been producing power at the moment of impact. There was no sabotage, no conspiracy, no hidden mechanical failure, no external villain that might have given the story the kind of dramatic explanation the public wanted. The cause was a capable but non-instrument rated pilot who flew into conditions that exceeded his training, whose body lied to him about which way was down, and who did not have the skills to override those lies with his instruments. It was, in the language of aviation safety, a common accident type. Spatial disorientation killed private pilots every year in conditions almost identical to these. The only uncommon thing about this particular accident was the name on the pilot's license. George magazine survived John's death, but not for long, and not in any form he would have recognized or wanted. Hachette Filipacci, the publishing company that had been the magazine's corporate parent and financial infrastructure, assumed fuller editorial control after John died. The staff continued to work. Issues continued to be published through 2000 and into 2001. But the identity that had made George distinctive, the particular collision of politics and pop culture, the glossy irreverence, the sense that the magazine existed because one specific person with one specific name believed it should, could not be replicated by editorial committee or corporate directive. The issues that appeared after John's death were competent, but anonymous, indistinguishable from a dozen other political publications that already occupied the newsstands. The thing that had made George interesting, even when it was uneven, even when the editorial vision wobbled, was the tension of a Kennedy trying to build something outside the family myth, trying to create an identity that was neither purely political nor purely celebrity, but something restlessly, ambitiously in between. Without that tension, without John's face and John's name, and John's particular need to prove that he was more than an inheritance, the magazine had no reason to exist that the market could not satisfy elsewhere. George published its final issue in early 2001 and was formally shut down. In narrative terms, the project that was supposed to be John's declaration of selfhood did not outlive him by more than 18 months. It became, like so much else, one more artifact absorbed into the Kennedy story rather than standing apart from it. The Bessette family retreated from the public eye almost entirely. Anne Freeman, who had lost both Carolyn and Lauren in a single night, largely withdrew from media contact after the initial wave of funerals and public attention. There was no press tour, no family memoir, no foundation launched in the immediate aftermath, no effort to build a public legacy from the wreckage. The family's grief was handled in the way that most grief is handled when there are no cameras obligated to record it and no famous name to sustain the public's interest. Privately, quietly, away from the record, in rooms the rest of the world would never see. That withdrawal should be respected in the telling of this story. The temptation, in a narrative this saturated with celebrity and spectacle, is to pursue every surviving figure into their present day life and extract meaning from their silence. But some silences are not mysteries waiting to be solved. They are boundaries. The Bessettes did not owe the public their grief in 1999, and they do not owe it now. What can be said is this: a family that never sought entry into the Kennedy world lost two of its members to it, and the surviving members chose to process that loss outside the reach of the cameras and the columnists that had helped create the conditions for the catastrophe in the first place. The cultural afterlife of John and Carolyn's story has been, by contrast, remarkably persistent and remarkably revealing about what the public still wants from the Kennedy name. In the decades since the crash, their marriage and their deaths have been revisited through biographies, magazine retrospectives, fashion retrospections that canonize Carolyn's minimalist style as an enduring aesthetic reference point, and the kind of periodic tabloid reassessment that treats famous tragedies as renewable content, returning to the same images and the same questions on every significant anniversary. Elizabeth Beller's biography, which drew on interviews with people close to the couple and attempted to reconstruct the private reality behind the public image, became one of the most detailed accounts of the marriage and its pressures. Vanity Fair's September 1999 profile of Carolyn, published just 2 months after the crash, remains one of the most widely cited portraits of a woman the public had consumed as an image and never fully understood as a person. A piece that tried, belatedly and with genuine care, to describe who Carolyn Bessette actually was, rather than who the cameras had made her appear to be. The story has also generated the kind of ongoing public fascination that resists summary or rational explanation. Internet forums and social media accounts dedicated to Carolyn's style, to the couple's photographs, to the forensic re-examination of what went wrong in the marriage and in the cockpit, have persisted well into the 2020s. For a generation that did not experience the crash in real time, John and Carolyn have become something closer to mythological figures, representations of a particular kind of American beauty and a particular kind of American waste, their images circulating in a digital environment that would have horrified Carolyn had she lived to see it. The most significant marker of the story's cultural endurance arrived in 2026, when FX premiered a 9-episode limited series titled Love Story: John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette. The series, inspired by Beller's book and produced for streaming on Disney Plus, was described in official network materials as the story of a whirlwind courtship and high-profile marriage threatened by fame and media attention. That framing is notable not because it is surprising, but because it confirms that the core thesis of this story, that the public's appetite for the fairy tale was itself the destructive force, has survived 27 years and arrived at the center of a major prestige television production. The dramatization was not framed as a plane crash investigation or an aviation cautionary tale. It was framed as a love story in which the crash was the final consequence of everything the love could not survive. The culture, in other words, had caught up to the private reality that the people closest to John and Carolyn understood at the time. The danger was never the airplane. The danger was the name and the world that came with it and the appetite that never stopped. Carolyn Kennedy is the clearest living thread in this story, and the one whose trajectory most fully illustrates what it means to carry the Kennedy name forward when everyone else who shared it is gone. After losing her brother in July and her cousin Anthony in August of 1999, Carolyn became the sole custodian of the Kennedy family's direct presidential legacy. The last surviving child of John and Jacqueline Kennedy, The last person alive who had stood inside the White House is a daughter who had walked behind the caisson, who had been at Jackie's bedside when the cancer took her. She did not retreat from public life, but she entered it on terms that were recognizably her own, in a manner that reflected her mother's teaching more faithfully than anything John had ever attempted. Where John had sought visibility, the magazine, the public life, the attempt to build something new in the light, Carolyn sought purpose with discretion. She served as the honorary president of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library Foundation, stewarding her father's legacy through institutional work rather than personal spectacle. She edited books on civil liberties and the Constitution. She raised her three children, Rose, Tatiana, and John, in a privacy that was remarkable by Kennedy standards, managing the same surveillance pressures that had crushed Carolyn by deploying exactly the discipline Jackie had spent a lifetime teaching. In 2013, President Obama appointed Carolyn United States Ambassador to Japan, a post she held until 2017. She served with a seriousness that earned respect in diplomatic circles and that seemed, to the people who had followed the Kennedy story across decades, like a long-delayed arrival at the kind of public service the family name had always implied. She later served as ambassador to Australia under President Biden. In each of these roles, Caroline carried the name with a composure the public read as grace, and that may, from the inside, have felt more like the application of lessons learned at enormous personal cost. She does not give confessional interviews. She does not participate in the kind of retrospective storytelling that documentaries like this one represent. She has maintained, in effect, the fortress her mother built, not by hiding, but by choosing, carefully and consistently, what the public sees and what it does not. On the Bessette side, the public record thins almost to transparency. Anne Freeman has spoken rarely and briefly about her daughters. The family's grief has been processed outside the frame of public documentation, and the script should acknowledge that absence honestly rather than filling it with speculation. There are limits to what the archive offers, and pretending otherwise would violate the tone of authority the narrative has been building. What can be said is this: a family that never sought the Kennedy world lost two of its members to it, and the surviving members chose to grieve outside the reach of the cameras that had contributed to the catastrophe. There is one detail that should be named plainly before the story closes, because it is the simplest and most devastating fact in the entire narrative. When John's plane hit the water on July 16th, 1999, Caroline Kennedy became, at 41 years old, the sole surviving member of her immediate family. Her father was assassinated when she was 5. Her uncle Bobby was killed when she was 10. Her mother died of cancer when she was 36. Her brother died over the Atlantic when she was 41. She was the last one standing inside a name that the country had turned into a myth, and the myth had consumed everyone around her. That is not a lesson. That is not a moral about recklessness or celebrity or the dangers of private aviation. That is the residue of a particular kind of American life, a life in which being born into a famous family means inheriting not just the privilege and the access and the doors that open without knocking, but also the surveillance, the grief, the public appetite that never stops feeding, and the understanding that the people you love will be taken from you in ways the whole country will watch and none of them will fully understand. This story should not land as a cautionary tale about a man who flew a plane he should not have flown, though the aviation facts are clear and the NTSB's conclusions are not in dispute. And it should not land as a tabloid epitaph for a beautiful couple whose marriage was failing, though the marriage was under enormous strain. It should land as something harder and more honest than either of those frames. John Kennedy Jr. spent his entire life trying to build a self inside a name that did not belong to him. Carolyn Bessette spent the last 3 years of hers discovering that love, even real love, could not protect her from the machinery that came with that name. Between them sat the full weight of the Kennedy inheritance, the glamour and the grief, the tenderness and the surveillance, the public devotion and the private cost, and the crushing expectation that the photograph must always look beautiful, even when the life behind it is not. They were buried at sea together, their ashes scattered over the same Atlantic that had swallowed the airplane. The water does not remember them. The country has never stopped trying to.